This is Who Makes a Podcast? Conversations with your favorite podcast hosts about who they are, the shows they make, and why they make them. I'm your host, Chris Cookley, and my guest today is Scott Johnson. Scott has been podcasting for over 10 years, and he loves getting into deep conversations. He makes the podcast, What Was That Like? He lives in the Tampa Bay area of Florida in a little town called Safety Harbor. In this episode, we talk about finding guests with incredibly interesting stories and how to help them be comfortable enough to be truly vulnerable on a podcast. How Scott makes sure his guests have great sounding audio. They're not podcast hosts or radio broadcasters, they're just normal people, and Scott helps them get the most out of their audio situations. Scott has also grown his podcast to over 50,000 downloads in the first 30 days of a new episode, and he's on track to hit 5 million downloads by the end of this year. We talk about a few of the over 100 different things he's done to grow his podcast, and it's a little bit every single day. We also talk about how Scott monetizes his podcast. He does host-read ads that stay in the episode for a period of time, and then fall off and are replaced by other dynamically inserted ads. It's a really interesting system, and it's working well for him. He also has a Patreon to support his podcast, and we talk about that and what kind of bonus content he provides to his patrons. This was a great conversation with a very successful podcast creator, and I'm happy to have met Scott, and I'm very happy to share this little bit of his podcasting knowledge with you. You can find links to everything we talk about and the full show notes at whomakesapodcast.com/E22. And now here is my conversation with Scott Johnson. Scott, welcome to Who Makes a Podcast.
Thanks, Chris. I'm delighted to be here.
I am very excited to speak with you, not least because I discovered your podcast recently and have been absolutely loving it. You have some fantastic stories on it that you go through. Would you mind telling me a little bit more about yourself and if you're not from Florida, how you got to Florida?
Yeah, I was born in Ohio, but this is the boring part of the conversation. Nobody wants to know about my childhood and, and all that stuff. But yeah, I grew up in Ohio and I've lived in Florida for a long time now. Love it here. Don't miss the snow at all.
No. So we're recording this a couple weeks after Ian, I believe it was, Hurricane Ian went through. Did you get any of that at all? I know Tampa was supposed to be hit pretty hard, kind of got spared a little bit.
We got a big spare. Yes, it was at one point it was projected to come right at us, but then it took a turn to the east and we got really lucky, and the people south of us got really unlucky.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had a lot of rain but nothing at all. We lost power, but seeing what people are going through down in Fort Myers and Naples, I can't complain at all.
No, I can't even imagine having that happen. We had a tornado hit our street a year and a half ago, maybe, but it was barely an F1, and nothing happened to our house other than we lost power for 2 or 3 days, which was kind of unfortunate. My wife was breastfeeding at the time, so we had a deep freezer full of breast milk. I had to go run out and get a generator that morning. But
oh, wow.
Other than that, we got pretty lucky. There were some houses down the street that had a tree through the roof, but nothing like what that hurricane has done to some of those houses down in Florida. So I can't even imagine what they must be trying to deal with right now.
It's really sad. They'll be rebuilding for a while.
Yeah. So Your podcast is called What Was That Like? And the premise of it, if I have this right, and I'm pretty sure I do because I've listened to it, you have people come on and tell their stories, super interesting stories. Why did you start this particular podcast?
Well, you described the stories as super interesting, and I would say that's like the baseline.
Okay.
It's got to be really super, super crazy interesting, like really weird stories. Not necessarily weird, but stuff that you look at the title of the episode and you say, okay, I have to hear that story. I found out that when I started listening to podcasts, this was back in like 2011, maybe.
Okay.
I found that the podcasts and particularly the episodes that I like were where someone comes on and tells a story about something that happened. And even better if it was a true story. And I looked around and I couldn't find any podcast that was doing that, and at least not the way I would do it. And I had been doing this podcast I've only been doing for about 4.5 years, but I started a podcast. My first podcast was back in 2012, about 10 years ago.
Is that the Computer Tutor?
Yes. That's I have a computer business. And so when I started learning about podcasts, I thought, well, man, I should do a podcast for my business to get more clients. So I did this weekly podcast, just computer tips and tricks, mainly for non-techie people. Just breaking everything down, making it very simple. And I did that for a long time, like 450 episodes, something like that. So I knew how to do a podcast. And when I started thinking, okay, I want to do this podcast about personal stories that are really unusual, I said, there's no other place doing it like I would do it. I'll just do it myself. So I started doing it right then. That was in July of 2018 was the first episode.
You have had some, as you said, insane stories. I think one of the recent episodes that I listened to, one of the most recent ones that came out was about somebody who won the showcase on The Price is Right 3 times over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, that's incredible. How do you find these people that have these kinds of stories? At this point, are they coming to you and pitching stories?
Well, when I first started, I didn't have an audience. Nobody knew about this show because it was brand new.
Yeah.
So when I first started, I said, okay, I want to make a list of stories that I want to talk about, like somebody that was struck by lightning, or maybe somebody that got hit by a train, or, and I made a list and I started looking for these stories. I just would Google search for news, and then I'd try to contact the people. And so for a long time, that's how I found stories. And I'm still, even now, I'm always looking at the news. I look at Inside Edition. They do those kinds of stories. So I'm always looking for unusual stories like that. But at this point, the audience has gotten big enough that almost all of my stories now come from listeners. And they pitch me stories, and unfortunately, I've had to reject most of them just because they're not unusual enough.
Yeah.
Early on, I had someone contact me, sent me an email saying, okay, hey, I heard about your show. I've got a great story. One time I was walking out the front door of my house and I fell right on the porch and hit my head. And I had to go to the emergency room. Yeah, that's the whole story.
Was that the story?
So
incredible.
Not really a full podcast episode for that one. Not to minimize the fact that I'm sure it was traumatic for her when that happened, but it's just not something that is interesting enough,
Is that where you have a segment at the end of your podcast that listeners can call in and leave a short story, 5 minutes or something, telling a much shorter story? Is that where that came from, where people were pitching stories and they weren't quite enough for a main episode, but that people still wanted to be on?
Yes, that's kind of the way some of them came about, because even if there's a story that's really super interesting and might qualify as far as the topic, sometimes it just doesn't take long enough to tell. I want an episode to last like 45 minutes or maybe an hour.
Right.
And some of them just don't last that. You just can't stretch it out that long. So yeah, if somebody has a story that's interesting, and it doesn't have to be quite as crazy as my main episode stories, but just something interesting, something funny, something sad, really anything like that if you can tell it in 5 minutes, I'd say, yeah, record it on your phone, send it in to me, and we'll play it at the end of an episode. And people love those stories. And then the reason I put it at the end of the episode is because that keeps them listening all the way through to the end.
Yeah, very clever. What is your vetting process look like? What are you doing if somebody comes to you and says, I have a really interesting story? How are you confirming that, or are you confirming that?
Yeah, I verify each one. And that's usually when somebody gives me a summary, like on my website, there's a place where you can click to submit your story. And I kind of explain what I'm looking for and that kind of thing. And my response for a lot of people is two things. First, can this story take a half an hour or 45 minutes or an hour to tell? Because it has to be at least a very bare minimum is 30 minutes, but I really want it to be 45 to 60 minutes. So I ask them, can it take that long to tell if you'd go into all the details? And the second one is there a way to verify what happened? Now, understand, I'm not doubting what you're telling me,
right?
But I promote each episode as a true story, so I have to do my due diligence, and we can do that through like a police report or an online news article that was published at the time when it happened, or 911 audio, or a variety of things. I'm open to. I mean, I've had people send me FBI letters and stuff, and of course, I'm the only one that sees that stuff, so it's all held confidentially. But yeah, I have to make sure that what we're talking about really is a true story, because that's how I promote it.
How do you go about getting 911 audio? I didn't know that was a thing you could do.
Oh man, yeah. It's a different process for every jurisdiction throughout the U.S.
Is that like a freedom of access information request or something? I'm butchering the name of that.
Yeah, that's what it's a freedom of information.
Okay.
But yet, even with that, you can't always get it. In some cases, like if it's been more than a year or two, they sometimes just don't keep it longer than that. It's just erased to make room for more audio. And there's different states and different counties. And like I wanted to get one from Tennessee one time, and I contacted the place, and they said, the only people that can get audio from our state are people who live in the state.
Oh, wow.
So I had one of my friends who lives in Tennessee get the audio for me, and he sent it to me. And other places, like here locally, here in the Tampa Bay area, if something happens locally, I can request the audio. But if the audio includes any kind of medical information, like if the caller says he's bleeding or anything like that, they won't release it because of HIPAA regulations. Yeah. But yet in other places, I can put in an application or I can apply for it at the jurisdiction's website, and they will send me the audio by email like the same day. So it's, you just got to kind of go with the flow and see what kind of rules whatever this place goes by and try to get it.
I'm imagining some state government intern sitting at a desk in a basement just wishing that somebody would ask for some 911 audio that he could then search up and send out because he has nothing else to do.
Well, could be. I don't think that's the case, but
I'm sure it's not. But hey, it's Chris. Can I jump in here for a minute and ask if you have thought about making your own podcast? If you have, you may have realized there's a lot more that goes into it than you might have thought. Don't worry. I have a gift for you. I want you to have my podcast quick start checklist. From what microphone and recording software you should use to how you host and distribute your show, I'm here to help with all of that and more. My podcast quick start checklist will walk you through everything you need to know to start your podcast. I'll show you what's actually important. To get my podcast quick start checklist, go to whomakesapodcast.com/start and tell me where to send it. Now let's get back to the episode. How are you handling the guest recording process? Because the guests that they call in and they leave a message at the end of the episode, that very much sounds like it's coming over a phone. But the people that you actually have on your episode sound pretty good. So is there a process that you're working with to get a good quality recording from your guests?
Absolutely. Yeah. And quality audio is of utmost importance to me. And part of that is because I just like listening to podcasts that have good quality audio.
That makes all the difference.
Yeah, it really does. And so, yeah, whenever we figure out that this is going to be a good thing and we're going to have a conversation, we're going to record their story for the podcast, I have a full information sheet that I send people saying, okay, there's nothing real complicated, but you need a computer, although they actually could do it on an iPad or on their phone. And you need a headset and a microphone. Bluetooth doesn't work. Earbuds, not going to work. They don't sound, the quality isn't good enough. Plus, there's a lag when there's Bluetooth. It's not completely connected. So, and a lot of people, the people I talk to don't normally get interviewed. They're not like public speakers usually. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I'll have to say, okay, if you don't have a headset, like a gaming headset, usually works great. But if you don't have one, here's a link on Amazon. You can get one for like $20 or $30. And, and a lot of times they'll say, okay, yeah, I just ordered it. It'll be here in a couple of days. I have had some where I actually ordered the headset and had it shipped to the guest.
Okay.
Because they didn't have it. And it was a story that was important enough to me that it was going to be a really good episode. And I don't mind spending that, and they get a free headset from it.
Nice.
So, but yeah, and as far as recording, I use a service called Squadcast. It's at squadcast.fm, and it's kind of like Zoom in that the guest and myself, we can see each other, but I don't record any video. It's only an audio podcast, so we can see each other, but the audio for the guest is recorded on the guest's computer, and my audio is recorded on my computer. And then at the end, I download those two separate tracks, and then I can edit them and put them together. Because it's a lot easier to edit when each person's on their own track.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
you know how that works.
Oh, yeah. I do. I've had some but some interesting experiences where I've had some guests where there's been two guests, and trying to get individual audio tracks when I have two guests has been somewhat of a challenge, but we've made it work couple times.
Yeah, I think Squadcast you can have up to like 4 or maybe more than that, but at least 4, but I never have more than one at a time anyway. So 2 tracks is all I need.
Awesome. You do a pretty incredible job leading people through their stories when you're interviewing them, getting the stories out of them. What kind of preparation are you doing before you actually go into these conversations? And are you having sessions with your guests before you actually go to record the interview for the podcast to kind of learn more about the details?
That's a great question. And yes, it kind of depends on the guest and the story. But if I've had a few people that have written books about what happened to them, and I always read the book because that gives me, I always want to have as much information and as many details as possible, because that way, if there's something a really interesting aspect that I want to talk about, I know I can ask the guest about that. And any question that I ask, I almost always already know the answer to, but it just makes for good conversation because I have, whenever I'm talking to a guest, I've got like a page or 2 of notes in front of me. And I always have the conversation divided into 3 sections. The first one is what I just call the before. It's like the setup, like where did you live at the time? Who were you living with? What were you doing for work? And, just kind of a setup so that people know what their status was in life at the time. Then the second section is the biggest one, and that's the actual thing that happened. And that's pretty much a minute-by-minute narrative of, the person telling what happened. And then the third section is the after. Like, how long did it take you to recover? How long were you in the hospital, if that's something that happened? Did you get therapy? Did you have PTSD? How are you doing today? Are you fully recovered? Stuff like that. Would you have done anything different? So that's kind of the way that I have the conversation structured. And I know that because I have those notes all in front of me. And that's what I spend probably the most time on is researching and getting that ready. So I love when people send me a pitch for their story that right off the bat, they send me a full, long, detailed description of what happened. Because that's what tells me, first of all, it's going to be, whether or not it'll be a good topic, a good story for the podcast, but also it really helps me in putting my notes together so that we can kind of keep the conversation on track. And for a while, after a while, I started doing what I call a sound check. So since, like I said, a lot of these people don't record, they don't speak publicly, they probably don't have professional recording equipment. So I wanted to make sure that the audio was going to be okay. And I tell people, it might sound a little bit weird, but if you take your laptop into a walk-in closet and sit there and do the recording, it sounds like a studio.
Yeah.
Because all the clothes, absorb the sound. So some people actually do that. I get on camera with them the first time and I say, yep, there's clothes hanging in the background. They listened to my instructions. So, and that's really the main purpose for that sound check. So I call it a sound check. But I found over time that first sound check really serves another purpose, because since these people aren't used to being recorded, they're kind of nervous usually. And in some cases, they've never actually told this whole story in detail to another person. And they're kind of, nervous about how's it going to work, or am I going to do okay, and all this stuff. So when we're doing the sound check, I'll ask them a few questions, like maybe there's some things in the story that I'm not quite clear on, and I just want to make sure, that I have my details correct. And so we'll chat for a little while. And that means that a few days later, when we actually do the podcast conversation, they've already kind of been through it. They know what to expect. They know what they're going to see on their computer screen, and they've seen me. They know that I'm not scary. We're just going to have a conversation between two people. So it really helps them be a lot calmer and clear-headed when we actually do the recording, in addition to making sure the audio is going to be good. So, yeah, I love doing those pre-chats.
How long does the process typically take from the time somebody contacts you until you're actually getting down to doing the interview? I mean, you're doing a lot of research, obviously. How far out in advance are you scheduling these?
Well, it kind of varies, but it may be anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks, maybe.
Okay.
It kind of depends on my availability and their availability and when we can make it happen. So it just kind of varies, but not too far in advance.
Do you have like a bank of episodes stacked up, ready to go? Because you release consistently. So I would feel pressure to not have enough episodes kind of ready to go if it's only taking me a day or a couple weeks to get one scheduled and recorded.
Yeah, I release every other Friday, and I found when I first started, I wasn't really sure if I was going to stay with that or maybe go weekly or whatever. But the every other Friday has been really a perfect schedule for me. I mean, I know there was one week where I was scheduled to release on a Friday, and I was actually doing the interview on Tuesday. And that's way closer than, I like having a lot more margin than that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't have full episodes ready to publish that far in advance, but I have interviews recorded. Like right now, I've got, I think, three or four. So I know that's the hard part as far as getting that recorded and scheduling it. So I know if I have to work all night to get edited and, create the opener and do the outro and, read the ads, that's all on me. I'm not depending on somebody else's schedule to get that all done. But yeah, I like to have a few ahead of time just to give that little bit of margin, little comfort level.
Yeah, 3 to 4 every other week. That's a pretty comfortable place to be. A couple months out.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had anybody come back and give you feedback after their episode airs? Have they let you know if they got contacted by listeners or if there's been any kind of, I don't want to say backlash because I'm sure they're not bad stories, but just, and has anybody contacted you again after they were on?
Absolutely. Yeah. I for several guests, I've stayed in touch with them, and I have a Facebook group for the podcast, and there's, like 3,000 people in that group. And a lot of the guests are also in that group. So when I do a new episode, I post in the group saying, hey, here's the new episode. and people can comment on it. And a lot of times they'll have questions for the guest, and the guest can answer in the Facebook group, questions that
Nice.
that I didn't ask, during the conversation. But one of the surprising things that I've found is people who, like I mentioned, there were some people that have never told the story to another person verbally in all its detail. And I've had so many guests tell me afterward that it was therapeutic for them.
Yeah.
I'm not a counselor. I'm not a licensed therapist or anything like that. I'm just somebody who's curious, and I listen. And so many people have said, man, I can't believe how much better I feel. One woman in particular, her story was that her boyfriend died in his sleep, and she woke up to find him dead next to her. And she said, after we got all that out, before we talked, I was so worried, because as time goes by, you forget things. And I was so worried that I was going to forget some of the details of the story. But now it's all out there. It's recorded. I have it. I don't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah. I mean, that's a benefit I hadn't even thought about.
I never would have expected that aspect of it to happen, but it's very gratifying to find that people get some benefit by telling their story. And there are other benefits too.
Do you have an episode that you would say is one of the most impactful stories you've had on your podcast? And you can define impactful in any way that you want.
Yeah, there are a few. There was a lady named Amy, and she was in Oklahoma. And when this happened, she was working at a job in an office building, and she hated the job. And at the time, she weighed 355 pounds. And because she hated her job, she wasn't a very good employee. She worked in the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. And that was the building that was blown up back, I forget what year it was, but it was like in the late 90s, I think.
90s something, right?
And so she was at work when it happened. She was on the third floor. Someone came in and to her office and was asking her a question, and she doesn't remember if she answered that question or not because the building exploded. She fell 3 floors and was pinned or trapped under concrete and rubble, like 10 feet of concrete. And she was trapped there for like 6 hours before they were able to get her out. And while she was there, she decided on her own that if I survive this, I'm going to change my life because I'm not happy. I haven't been happy the way I am, and things are going to change. And she was able to get out. Well, at that time, she was an employee of a credit union. That's where she worked. And like I said, she didn't like it. And well, today she's the CEO of that credit union.
Oh, wow.
At the time, she weighed 355 pounds. And since then, she has lost that weight. And she has completed an Ironman triathlon. So to say she's turned her life around is kind of an understatement.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And so now she's still the CEO, but she also does public speaking. She'll travel and speak to groups and talk about, no matter where you're at in life, if you're not happy, you can turn it around. And so, yeah, her story has had a big impact on a lot of people, not just my listeners, but, she's helping a lot of people.
You wouldn't happen to know what episode number that is, would you?
That's episode 95. It's called Amy's Office Was Bombed.
I will include a link to that in my show notes.
Of course, now I've given out all the spoilers. So,
well, I'm sure that the telling of the story will be just as exciting as the reveal at the end.
It's really an amazing story. I always go by the criteria that if the guest is crying when they tell the story, it's going to be a good episode. And if the listeners, I've had so many episodes that the listeners shed some tears as well. There was one recently called Courtney's Mom Chose When to Die. It's about assisted medical death. And man, that's one of my favorite episodes just because of that.
I'm sure that would have touched a lot of people who were listening.
Yeah.
So you make, are you still making the Computer Tutor podcast?
No, I ended that about a year ago.
Okay.
Just because, but I still do a blog and an email newsletter for my computer business because I'm still doing that. It's kind of like I have 2 full-time jobs right now. But yeah, I ended the podcast just because of time constraints, and this podcast is getting much bigger, so I wanted to put more time into it.
Have you done any other shows, or has it just been these 2?
I did one other podcast. I did 88 episodes.
Oh, wow.
That was in like the years 2014 to 2016, roughly. Completely unrelated to computers, but kind of related to these stories. I'm involved in the ultra running community where, people do what are called ultra marathons. It's any race longer than 26 miles, longer than a marathon. And I've always been fascinated by human endurance. And so I did a podcast called Ultra Finishers, where I would talk to regular everyday runners, middle of the pack, back of the pack runners who had just completed their first ultra marathon, like a 50K or a 100K or a 100 miler. And just talk to them like, how did you train? What was it like when you did it? What was your worst pain? How have you recovered since then? And, just questions like that. So that's kind of where I learned some of the interviewing skills. And so we did 88 episodes of that. That was every week. So that was quite a time-consuming thing. And eventually I had to stop that one as well because of the time requirements. Just couldn't keep up with it.
And I assume that you run if you're involved in that community?
I used to. I bike now.
Okay.
I did my first ultra marathon in 2014 and did a few, 50Ks, 50 milers. And then finally in 2017, my big goal is I completed a 100 miler. And after that,
retired.
I have to have some kind of a goal to shoot for.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do a 200 miler. So, after I finished that one, I said, okay, I think it's time to switch to biking. So now I bike every morning.
I'm on team cycling for sure. I'd rather be riding a bike than running personally. Do you listen to many podcasts now? Do you have time for that?
I do. My morning bike ride and whatever time I spend in the car, that's my podcast listening time. And I love listening to podcasts. I listen to podcasts about podcasting.
All right.
There's one called The School of Podcasting, and the host is Dave Jackson. And he's the guy that actually helped me start my first podcast. So I've been listening to him. That's every Monday morning. And I listen to some self-improvement shows, the Jordan Harbinger Show, Tim Ferriss. And I like storytelling shows. There are a couple of podcasts that are kind of similar to mine that I love listening to. There's one called This Is Actually Happening. And there's another one called The Secret Room. And I've contacted both of those hosts, and we've done full episode swaps because the content is similar enough that we each know that our audiences would like to hear about the other show, and it helps both of our shows grow.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've heard about most of those. I have not heard about The Secret Room, so I'm going to have to go check that out, I think.
Yeah.
I've heard you say at least once, maybe a couple times, that your show's getting larger. How big is your podcast right now?
Well, by the end of this year, I'll go over 5 million downloads. And the criteria that most, like if you're talking to an advertiser, what they want to know is how many downloads do you get for a new episode in the first 30 days?
Yep.
And I'm doing over 50,000 on that. I've had one episode that's gotten close to 60, but it's gradually growing. I promote in a lot of different ways. And I just like to see the numbers. As long as they keep going up, I'm happy.
Was there anything that you did at some point over the last 4.5 years that you think contributed to a rapid increase in listenership? or has it just been slow and steady up and to the right?
I would say mostly slow and steady. You know, I talk to a lot of podcasters, and everybody wants to know what's that one big thing I can do.
Yeah, what can I do to
written up in the New York Times, or that one big thing that's just going to explode my show.
How can I blow my podcast up?
That's just not the way it works. It's getting a few listeners at a time, engaging with people. I'm actually going to write a book about this because I've documented everything I've done to promote my show.
Oh, that's great.
And right now I've got like 120 different things that I've done. But as far as the ones where I noticed the biggest effect, one was, as I mentioned already, is promo trades, where I'll contact another podcaster and I'll do a host-read ad for their show on my show, and they do the same thing for my show on their podcast. And it's got to be a similar type audience, so I've done a lot of those, and I've done podcast guesting where I'll go on somebody else's show, kind of like I'm doing right now. And I also do a lot on Facebook. And a lot of podcasters have said, I tried Facebook, I posted, and nobody looks at it. It doesn't really help. But you got to do it the right way. And I get for every single episode, I get new listeners from Facebook every time.
What would be something that somebody is probably not doing correctly on Facebook that they should be doing differently? What's the right way?
The biggest mistake that I see, and the most often, is they'll go in a group or even on their own Facebook profile, and they'll say, new episode, and then they link to whatever the website page for that episode or whatever they link to. I don't know. But that would generate no interest at all. Nobody cares that there's a new episode. They're just scrolling through Facebook. Okay, new episode. Well, that's what everybody else says. They don't know what the podcast is about. They don't know what that episode is about, and who cares? So that's why, you're not going to get much from that. But for me, when I post on Facebook, for every episode I put out every other Friday, I'm posting in probably close to 100 different Facebook groups.
Oh, wow.
And that's every single time. And what I post is, first off, there's an image with every one. I have graphics. I have a graphics guy that creates images related, with the title of the show and the website URL for that episode right in the image. And then what I post on Facebook is, it's always the same format. The first two sentences or two or three sentences is, what was that like? Or it says, my podcast is called What Was That Like? Each episode is a conversation with someone who's been through some extremely unusual situation. The guest comes on the show and tells what happened firsthand. That's the first section. It's always the same. So that way people know what the podcast in general is about. The second one is what that episode is about. Like, Amy was at work one day and she didn't know what happened, but all of a sudden she was trapped under concrete. And here's her story. That's the second one. So that's what that episode is about. The third section is, it just says, find it on any podcast app, including Spotify, or at the website address shown in the image. Because you don't want to include any website link in a Facebook post. Facebook will penalize you for that.
Really?
Because a link means somebody's leaving. They're leaving Facebook. They're going somewhere else. So I put the website address in the image.
Okay.
So it's not a link, and Facebook's algorithm doesn't see that as a link. But if somebody wants to, they can type that address in their web browser and go to that episode, or they can just get out their phone, pull up their podcast player app, and search for What Was That Like?
And are you doing this yourself, or do you have like a virtual assistant posting these on your behalf? 100's a lot of groups to go to.
Yeah, it takes a little time. I have a VA doing that now. I did it on my own for a long time so that I could learn, intimately how it works and what to expect. But I have someone else that does that for me now.
And you said that you run ads on your podcast. I know you have a Patreon. Do you monetize your podcast in any other ways?
Nope, that's it. Sponsored ads and my Patreon group. And Patreon supporters, of course, get extra bonus content that you can't get unless it's $5 a month, but they get that. And they get all the new podcast episodes without any ads.
What kind of stuff are you putting in the Patreon as bonus?
The Patreon content is a series of episodes that I call raw audio. And each episode they're going to hear 911 calls, the actual audio, as well as the stories that go with that audio. Like I'll introduce something saying, hey, these two people, this was in Columbus, Ohio, and these two people were at home, and all of a sudden somebody broke in their house and were holding them at gunpoint. They were hiding in a closet, and they called 911. And that's when I'll play the 911 audio. And then when that's done, I just kind of tell, what happened afterward, how who, if they were shot, or if the guys were arrested, or whatever happened in that. So I usually have 3 stories like that in each raw audio episode.
Okay.
And so that's the incentive for people to sign up for my Patreon.
And those are not related necessarily to the main podcast episode that week?
Completely unrelated.
Okay.
Actually, I do. It's not even on the same schedule. I do a new raw audio episode like every month and a half, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. They're basically paying for a whole nother podcast then. Just a whole completely different thing.
Yeah. That's kind of what it is.
Cool. I listened back to episode 1 because I was curious what it sounded like back then versus what it sounds like now. And obviously you've had, a decade of podcasting experience. So it didn't sound all that different, honestly. It sounded like the same show. So like kudos to you for getting that format kind of nailed down right off the bat.
Thank you. I got really lucky with episode 1 and the story that was in that one.
Yeah, it was an incredible story.
Wow. Yeah. And when I talked to Jennifer, who was the guest on that one, about coming on and telling the story, she was completely trusting in me because I had no previous episodes for her to listen to.
Yeah.
She didn't know who I was other than what we had talked on the phone. But she came on and just told that story, and what a heartbreaking story it was. And I got the 911 audio for that. That was another thing I was so lucky about. I contacted, just for people who don't know, the story, what happened is Jennifer was driving with her 2 young girls, and it was nighttime. She pulled into the intersection and didn't see a motorcycle that was approaching from the left. And the motorcycle hit her car. And so she pulled over, and the guy's laying in the street, and he ended up dying. And at the time, she pulled over, left her kids in the car, went over, was with him in the road, and she called 911 from there. And I knew I wanted to get that audio because, boy, the thing about 911 audio is it puts the listener right at the scene.
Yeah, it doesn't get any more real than that.
I mean, it's not a recreation. There's no script, So this was in Texas. So I contacted the sheriff's department that handled that. And I talked to a lady there, and she said, well, I'm going to try to get it for you. But our policy is if the call has any personal information, like people's names, or if they give their phone number or whatever, then we can't release that audio. And I said, okay, well, just let me know. Well, like a week later, I get a CD in the mail because and the funny thing is, I talked to her about this, and I actually sent her a thank you card later because she listened to the audio to make sure it was that information was not on there. And there was personal information on that audio, but she went through and redacted it. She, she bleeped it out on her own so that I could use that audio rather than just saying, sorry, can't help you.
Yeah.
She did that. She went the extra mile. So that was how I was able to get the 911 call for that particular episode. That was actually, there were 3 911 calls. Jennifer called, but then there was somebody else that called as well. So I got both of them.
I had a question about episode 1, and I'm going to ask you about it, but now I feel like I have to ask, do you remember the details of that? Like the guest's name and what happened just because it was episode 1? Or could I just throw out episode 67 and you could tell me the person and what it was about?
I wouldn't know it most of them based on episode number. But if you told me the title of the episode, I could pretty much give you the details. Although it's getting more and more difficult. I've got, 118 now. And so, some of them, if I go back and listen to them a second time, I hear things that I don't remember.
Yeah.
Even though I was in that conversation.
Right.
But,
well, it's been 4 years.
Yeah. I don't have a photographic memory, unfortunately.
All right, so my initial question about episode 1, tying back to the ads and Patreon conversation briefly, there were what sounded like dynamically inserted ads in that episode. How were you? How was that being done? Is that through your hosting platform?
Yes, it's through my hosting. And I didn't do any ads for the first 3 years. And that was deliberate because I wanted the audience to be big enough so that the ads would be worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't want to bother my audience with an ad if I'm going to make $100 on it or something. So I wanted to wait until the audience got big enough. And so now every new episode has 2 or 3 ads, and those ads stay in the episode for 90 days. And after 90 days, those ads are replaced by dynamically inserted ads, as well as pre-roll and post-roll ads. That all happens after the 90-day point.
And are the initial 90-day ads, are those host read, and then the dynamic ads are just somebody else is doing an ad for another company?
Yes. Yeah, all the new ones are all host read ads. I read those myself.
Do you have any control over what kind of ads are put on your episodes? Do you know what's being advertised there?
I can control based on category.
Okay.
You know, I have a list of check boxes, and I can uncheck the ones like there's no ads for politics, or there's a few categories like gambling, you know. But I mean, for the most part, you can hear just about anything.
Yeah. Who are you hosting with that's doing that?
I host with Audio Boom.
Audio Boom. That's a new one for me.
Yep, I was with Libsyn for 3 years, and then when I started taking on sponsors, I switched to Audio Boom because they get sponsors for me.
Awesome.
And that means they give me free hosting as well.
Oh, very nice.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, you've released a large number of episodes for your podcast, 118-ish, and obviously even more for the Computer Tutor. Rest in peace. How do you how are you staying motivated to continue making new episodes? Is this obviously you're running ads, you got the Patreon, this is making money for you now. Is it because it's a business and like you're just a professional that does this now, or is it still fun? What's keeping you going?
It's absolutely still fun. And yeah, it's nice. And I had from the beginning, I kind of knew that this was going to be a big show and I was going to monetize it eventually. But I mean, I did it for 3 years without making any money. And you can't do something like that unless you are really pretty passionate about it.
Yeah.
But at this point, man, I get to talk to people who have been through unbelievable things. And I mean, it's just part of it's just my natural curiosity. You know, if I'm out to eat, or if I'm at a party or something, and I happen to sit down next to somebody, and they happen to mention that they got bitten by a rattlesnake one time, well, I'm going to have all kinds of questions for that person because I want to know exactly, what really happened. I mean, what's the name of the show? What was that like when that happened? So I get to do that. I get to ask these people questions. I just love it because I love stories anyway. I think a lot of people just love a good story. And for me to be able to find these stories and bring them to a large number of people, not to mention the fact that I get to enjoy them myself.
Yeah.
That's a great job.
Do you have any thoughts or desires to expand to making more podcasts? Or are you pretty content with just the one?
I'm okay with this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know what's involved with this one. And I mean, I know there are people that do multiple podcasts, but I would rather focus on this one and just make it be really good and put out quality content than to do, 2 or 3 podcasts and have them not be released on a consistent schedule or not be exciting content.
What about something like a story told over 8 or 10 episodes, and that's all the podcast was, kind of like what NPR does with some of their Serial or S-Town or any of those kinds of shows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be open to something like that. Honestly, as far as just a matter of time, I wouldn't have time to research and write and do all that. But I wouldn't mind collaborating with somebody that if somebody wanted me to read, to host a show like that, yeah, I'd be okay with that. I mean, I look at Phoebe Judge. She does Criminal, one of the top true crime podcasts, and yet she does an extra show. She has a show called This Is Love, and it's unrelated to any kind of true crime. She just talks about interesting stories. Of course, she has a team of people as well.
Yeah.
I'm one person.
Yeah. Roman Mars has a team of people, and yeah. I forgot all about Criminal. I used to listen to Criminal, and you said that name, and it sparked in my head, and I could not for the life of me place who it was. So thank you for, giving the title of the podcast.
Oh, the best voice in podcasting is Phoebe Judge.
What advice would you give to somebody who might be thinking about starting an interview podcast specifically, kind of along the veins maybe of making sure that they can get the most out of their guests?
I would say the real fundamental requirement is that you have a genuine interest in your guest and what they're talking about. What makes a really good story, and if you listen to any of my episodes, a lot of my guests, they get really vulnerable. It's like nobody else is in the room. It's just them telling me this really personal, sometimes tragic story. And I think you have to make people feel comfortable enough to do that. One of the things that I do at the beginning, and this is something that I heard Tim Ferriss say one time, is when we have we're actually doing the podcast recording, but there's always a few things to go over just before we actually start talking, before we hit record. And in order for your guest to be vulnerable, it helps if I, as the host, show vulnerability. So what I will often do is say, look, we're recording. This is not live. If you need to take a break, get a drink of water, whatever, all of that gets edited out. So nobody hears that. As a matter of fact, sometimes I'll ask a question and I'll just completely screw it up. And so when that happens, you'll know it. I'll know it. I'll just say, okay, I'm going to back up. Going to ask that question again. And like I said, nobody ever hears any of that. So by that little example, I'm telling them, yeah, I do this all the time and I mess up and it's okay. It's no big deal. So that kind of makes them a little more comfortable that they don't have to get every word correct or perfect. And they have, like I probably do, a lot of crutch words. A lot of people end every sentence or every phrase with right. And these people, a lot of them don't even realize they do it. But in the editing process, I edit minute by minute to get most of that out of there. You don't want to take all of it out so that it sounds unnatural, but I try to make them sound as good as I possibly can. I've had guests come back and say, man, I can't believe I sounded great on there. And that means that they're more likely to share it with people too.
Yeah.
Because if they sound awful, they don't want anybody to hear it. But, if it turns out to be a really good conversation, then, they're going to share it with everybody they know.
I think we may have listened to the same Tim Ferriss episode.
Yeah.
I don't know what episode it is. I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes if I can locate it. But Tim has got hundreds and hundreds of episodes.
There was an episode where he went through his whole recording process. Yeah. And I love that. That was very, very informative.
He did something similar on Rolf Potts's Deviate podcast as well. I think the very first episode of Rolf Potts's podcast is Tim Ferriss, and Rolf is interviewing Tim about how to do a podcast. So there's another hour or two of Tim explaining how to make a podcast. But yeah, he's had a couple of those episodes that have been fantastic.
Yeah. And Tim has had a pretty fair amount of success with his podcast.
He has. What do you see for the future of your podcast? Do you like what you're doing now? Do you want to change it in any way? Are you considering changing the format at all?
I'm not really considering changing the format, but I know that over time it will change.
Has it changed since episode 1?
Yes. Not drastically, but
yeah.
After about 2.5 years, I did a listener survey, and I asked people a lot of questions because I knew I was going to be talking to advertisers, and advertisers like to know who my listeners are, age, gender, all that kind of stuff, demographic information. So I asked a lot of questions. And one of the questions I asked is, if you could change anything about the podcast, what would you change? And several people said the same thing. And if you listen to the first episode, you heard this. First, a couple of years, for the opening, it was a pre-recorded opening. And I would just do an intro saying, welcome to What Was That Like, where we talk to people and we get inside their head and find out what they were thinking and, and ask them, what was that like? Here we go. And I said that and that was pre-recorded. So, it was obviously the same thing every single time.
Yeah.
And when I did the listener survey, several people said, I would probably get rid of the here we go, because I guess it just gets old after a while. And
okay.
I agreed. I had actually thought about changing it, but, I'm busy trying to find people and recording conversations and all that. So that was my incentive. So I created a different intro recording where what I have actually are like 6 or 8 clips from previous episodes. And so that's what plays now. I've added that. And now that's been going on for, a year and a half, maybe 2 years now. So it's probably time to come up with a new one of those. I'm starting to think about that. And in the beginning, I didn't have the listener stories segment at the end either. So we've added that since then. But beyond that, I don't really know. I might have an idea next week and say, hey, let's do this. But right now, I don't have any plans to make any major changes.
I think those are probably 2 good changes to have made. I like the intro to your podcast with the multiple listeners or guests, I guess, giving the clips. It's There's a couple other podcasts that do that, and it's energetic and it sounds good.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of pre-podcasting routine that you go through, like things to get your voice warmed up or to get comfortable or anything like that?
I always make sure I got a bottle of water, like before we actually record a conversation. But I don't really do voice exercises or anything like that. I know some podcasters do, but I've just never done that. Maybe I should.
I have no advice to give. I kind of just make sure that I try to talk a lot for 15 minutes or so.
Ah, okay.
I work from home on the computer by myself, so I don't have to say a lot during the day normally. So when I record these at night,
I'm the same way. I work from home and usually here by myself. And I don't know. I just start talking.
Yeah. And what kind of technical setup are you working with right now? I briefly saw on the video, nice looking microphone. I mean, your audio quality sounds great. What are you using to record with? And then has that changed since you started this podcast, or is it the same equipment that you've had the whole time?
It has changed. I started out, my microphone for quite a while was an Audio-Technica ATR 2100. And that's the mic I used for the Computer Tutor podcast from the beginning and the Ultra Finishers podcast. And it's a great mic. I wouldn't have any problem with using it even now. But I just love the sound of my current mic is a Shure SM7B. And
classic.
Yeah, a lot of podcasters use it. It's the one Joe Rogan uses. And it just has, I love the sound, but it's what's called gain hungry. Mm-hmm. It requires a preamp. So in line with the microphone cable is a preamp called a FET head. And that's one. There's another one called Cloud Lifter that's very common. So I have the Shure SM7B mic, inline preamp, the FET head, that goes into a Focusrite Scarlett Solo interface, and that's what I have my headphones plugged into as well. And then that plugs into a USB port on my computer.
And then you are recording in, well, I guess you're recording on Squadcast, but you edit in Hindenburg? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I do all my editing in Hindenburg Journalist Pro.
Okay. And that is a DAW that I have not had any experience with.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, the big popular one that's free is Audacity, and a lot of podcasters use that. I just love Hindenburg because it's just really easy to use. It's not free, but I got lucky and got it at a really low price.
Do you do a lot of editing on your episodes?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I do surgical editing, minute by minute. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
But I think it's really worth it because the episode's going to be up forever, and it's worth putting the time into to make sure it sounds as good as possible.
And that is something that you're still doing yourself. You're not outsourcing that?
I do that myself. At this point, I really can't picture outsourcing that because I know I could outsource like for somebody to get rid of crutch words or, to fix the audio if there's a problem or whatever. But I have to edit for content myself because there might be a section where the guest and I talk over each other. And now I got to decide, who do I leave in? How do I kind of rearrange those words to make it sound normal without having two people talking at the same time? And I know what my vision is for the end product, and I'm not sure that I could be comfortable outsourcing that and having somebody else do that kind of editing.
Yeah, it would be hard to outsource the artistic vision, the storytelling part of the process to somebody else. Because at that point, is it, I don't know. To me, it feels like, would it even be your podcast then?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are storytelling podcasts that they record and then they just send the file to an editor. And that's great. But I just don't feel like I could be comfortable doing that.
I know that you have recently had all of your episodes transcribed, which is a big undertaking. Would you mind talking through why and how you had that done?
Yeah. I looked at a bunch of different options for doing that. I wanted to have it done because I want to make sure my content is available to as many people as possible. And there are some people who just prefer to read as opposed to listening. So if somebody can read the conversation and they want to do that, then that's fine. They should have that opportunity. But probably more important than that is there are people who are hearing challenged or people who are completely deaf, and they just don't have the option of listening to the audio. And, making each podcast episode available as a full transcription means that they can take advantage of it as well. So I looked at a lot of options, and there are a lot of AI options for transcription. You upload your audio, the computer listens to it, and it spits back, the words. The problem is for almost all of them, for all of them that I tested anyway, the accuracy rate isn't anywhere close to what I wanted.
No, I tried that for a while when I started the podcast. I was using Otter AI to transcribe some episodes, and I wanted to have really accurate transcripts for each of my episodes, but it would take not very long for them to do the transcription, but then I would be working for 2 or 3 hours just fixing the mistakes. And I just couldn't take that time each episode to do that.
Yep. And that's exactly the same thing I ran into. So finally I said, okay, the automated part isn't going to work. And so I found 2 people. One person did most of them, but I had 2 people working on it, different episodes. And this one person is also going to be already does all of my future episodes. When I put an episode together before it goes live, I send him the audio and he transcribes it. But I actually have it done by humans because that's really the only way you can have it be completely accurate. And it's not cheap, but to me, I think it's worth it.
And those live up on your website. So there's a transcript under each episode page, say?
Yes, there's a transcript is part of the show notes. It's after the beginning part of the show notes, you see the full transcript listed right there on the website for each episode. And there's also a link where you can download a PDF if you want to get that. And more recently, I've taken all of the transcripts from all the past episodes right up to the current one and put them in a single ebook, and I sell that for $10. So if somebody wants, rather than going to each individual web page and downloading and putting it together, I've already done that work. So for $10, they can get all of them.
That's fantastic. Has anybody taken you up on that yet?
Yeah, well, it only came out a couple of weeks ago. I finished that, and but yeah, I've had a few people purchase that.
Cool. Well, I'm getting kind of down to the end of my questions, Scott. This has gone quickly, and it's been fantastic. Where do you see podcasts going in the future?
I see podcasts becoming much more popular than they are now. For me, I haven't listened to commercial radio in the car for probably 10 years because I just can't imagine listening to that anymore when there's so much good content. I can't keep up with the podcasts that I'm subscribed to. And when you turn on the car radio, it's either politics or sports, which I don't like to listen to either one of those, and or it's 20 minutes of content and 10 minutes of commercials.
Yeah.
And you got commercials with car dealers screaming at you, and I hate all of it.
Yeah, when I get in my car, the Bluetooth cannot connect fast enough to my phone.
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. But yet, still, there's a lot of people that still listen to the radio, just because some people they don't yet know about podcasts. Maybe they've heard the word, but they don't know how it works, and they don't understand that a subscription really doesn't mean you pay anything. It's all free. Of course, there's some that you pay for, but I think it's just a matter of more people becoming more aware of what's out there. I kind of enjoy coming across someone who has never listened to a podcast and they don't even know what's available because, as you know, no matter what they're interested in, if they have a hobby, if they have a favorite sports team, it doesn't matter. Anything they're interested in, there is a podcast about it, and probably several.
Someone is making a show, for sure.
Yeah, and they don't even know about it yet. So I love introducing people to podcasts, and because there's a whole world waiting for them there. They don't even know it yet.
What would you say is one of the most important lessons that you've learned about podcasting since you started making your show?
I would say in talking to these people, so many people that have told me very personal stories, I think it's even more, I'm a pretty empathetic person by nature, but now I think it's really important to be genuinely interested in other people and what they've been through. And that's kind of carried over into my real life too, not just the people I talk to on the podcast. I try to make a conscious effort to be kind, to be nice to people, to be interested when they're talking, to listen to them, to genuinely listen to them. And I think it's something that would be good for everybody to learn.
Yeah, I think that's a great lesson. I struggle with that sometimes, and I try to be aware of it when somebody that I don't know is speaking to me, and I just don't want to listen. But I'm something that I'm working on.
Mm-hmm.
What is something that you maybe thought I would ask you, but I haven't?
I thought that you would ask, Scott, what's the weirdest story you've ever heard on your podcast?
Scott, what's the weirdest story you've ever heard on your podcast?
Chris, thanks for asking.
I went with impactful.
Yeah, okay. That's good. That's good too.
Switch it up. What is the weirdest story, though?
The weirdest story, this is a story that I still have. Some of my regular listeners have said, I've listened to all your episodes except that one. I just can't listen to that one. And this story is, let me see, what episode number is it? I think it's 28. It is 28. This episode is titled, Shiny Ate His Own Foot.
Oh, boy.
This was a young man who, he had a group of friends, and they would sit around and talk, and you know how conversations go. Sometimes the question would come up, if you could taste human flesh, and this is kind of appropriate because the Dahmer series is on Netflix right now. I just finished watching that. But this question would come up, if you could taste human flesh and it was legal and ethical, maybe even healthy, would you do it? And, most of them would say, sure, yeah, why not? Knowing, of course, that it would never happen. Well, not long after that, this man, Shiny is, of course, not his real name. He wanted to remain anonymous, but he was in a motorcycle accident. and he had to have his foot amputated. And he was leaving the hospital, and before he left, he said, "Hey, can I have my foot?" And it was kind of an unusual request. They still had the foot in a refrigerator, and they had him sign some paperwork, disclaimers and liability releases and stuff like that. But they gave him his foot. And so he got back home, and he started calling his friends, saying, "Hey, you remember that conversation we had?"
Oh, my God.
And they said, "All right, let's do it." He has some unusual friends.
Bust out the Traeger, get the smoker going.
So there was a day that there were about 10 of them that came over to his house for brunch. And one of his friends is an actual chef, and they had what they call foot tacos. And so, yeah, that was probably the most unusual thing. And the interesting thing about that is toward the end of our conversation, he kind of turned it around on me, and he said, "Well, what about you? Would you ever take the opportunity of tasting human flesh if it was legal?" And I said, I thought I had an out, because I said, "Well, I'm vegan, so I don't eat meat." And so, yeah, it really wouldn't be an option for me. And he said, "Well, now hang on a second. People are vegan because the animal can't give consent. The animal has to be killed for you to eat meat. And in this case, full consent. I'm inviting you. And it's completely ethical. Most times when you hear about cannibalism, somebody gets murdered first.
Sure.
And that doesn't happen in this case. So, but I said, no, I still wouldn't do it.
His next suggestion was going to be that he had some flash frozen and it's just sitting on ice waiting for the next person to ask.
Waiting for the right opportunity. Yeah. No, they didn't make a full meal out of it. It was like they had each had a 2-inch square that they cut off. But
I have it downloaded and it's in my podcast queue. So
okay,
I'll check it out.
It's a fun one. It's not nearly, when you hear the story, you think, "Oh, that is so gross," but it's not gross or gory or anything. He's a very well-spoken man, and he just has some unusual group of friends.
Very curious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, Scott, this has been absolutely fantastic. I have learned a ton. You have been an incredible guest. Yeah, very well-spoken, obviously. Your podcast is a blast to listen to, so everybody should go check that out. Where can people find you? Where do you want to send people?
Well, if you go to any podcast app and just search for "What Was That Like?", you'll see it come up. It's on Spotify, all the major platforms. And or you can just go to the website, which is whatwasthatlike.com. All the episodes are there. You can listen to them right on the website if you want to. Or, as we mentioned, you can click to read the transcript.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking with me. I had a great time.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate you having me on. It was fun.
That was my conversation with Scott Johnson, host of the podcast What Was That Like?, which can be found on all of the major podcast networks. You can also find Scott at whatwasthatlike.com. My name is Chris Cookley, and you can find me at whomakesapodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, it would be an enormous help if you shared it with your friends. How about picking one person you know who you think would benefit from listening to this? Send them a text with a link to this episode. Do it right now. I'd really appreciate it. And if you host a podcast and would like to be my next guest on Who Makes a Podcast, please let me know. Go to whomakesapodcast.com/guest and tell me about your show. This is Who Makes a Podcast. I'll be back next time with another conversation with another incredible podcast host. Thanks for listening.